There are some people in this world who have an unfortunate event in their life recorded for all the world to see, and they become associated with that, even though it's not a fair representation of who they are. When I say that, you can probably think of a couple of examples of people you know or famous people you've heard of. For whatever reason, the example that always comes to my mind, and this will date me just a little bit, is a guy named Bill Buckner. Are any baseball fans in the crowd? Yeah. You know Bill Buckner for what reason? That he was a 290 career hitter, that he had close to 2,000 hits, that he was a really solid, really good baseball player, but we all remember him because in the 1986 World Series, he couldn't bend far enough to field a ground ball that went right through his legs that cost the Red Sox the World Series. One of my earliest childhood memories of sports was the hatred and the vitriol that flowed towards Bill Buckner for the rest of his life, unfortunately. There's a couple of guys like that in the Bible, and today we want to talk about one of them. His name is Thomas, who we all know because he doubts, right? Doubting Thomas. And my job for you this morning is to debunk that myth. It's not true, and it's not fair. Actually, John is holding up Thomas as an example for all of us. So whatever you say about Thomas, what's the old thing we said when we were kids? I'm rubber and you're glue. Whatever you say bounces off me and sticks to you, or something like that. Whatever you want to say about Thomas, look out, because it's coming right back to you. So if you copy the scriptures, you can turn to John chapter 20, and we'll read together. If you don't have a Bible, no worries. We'll have it on the screen for you. John chapter 20, verse 19, and we'll read to the end of the chapter. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I'm sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hands into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood amongst them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out your hand, put it into my side." The original language is the Greek word balo. It means to throw. Throw your hand right in my side. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God. Because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Word of God for the people of God. So what on earth is going on here? Well, first, let's talk about doubt together and try to get our minds and our heads around it. And what I want you to at least wrestle with, you don't necessarily have to agree with me, but at least wrestle with for a couple of moments together here is this idea of doubt and its universal presence. This is what I want to suggest to you is Thomas is not a doubter. The people of God have long been doubters. And so you can't really look through the Bible and not find incidents of doubt in almost every single chapter of it. You start with doubt in the garden, right? Adam and Eve doubt the goodness of God, and it leads them into all kinds of bad places. Abraham, who is the champion of faith for Jewish people and for all of the people Jesus is talking to in the Gospel of John, is a person who is given to lots of doubt, isn't he? I mean, he has tremendous amounts of faith in what he does, And then when God says you're going to have a child, right? He and his wife laugh at God. Why? Because they don't think it's possible. It's not going to happen. And then when famine comes into the land, what does he keep doing? Going down to Egypt, out of the land that God promised. And oh, by the way, when he goes down to Egypt, what does he do down there? He tells Pharaoh that this is my sister, not my wife, right? And he throws his wife under the... And so all of these ways, he's not trusting, he's doubting, and it goes on. We see it through all of it. Isaac, his son, is the same way. And leading all the way up through the Old Testament into the New Testament. The beginning stories of the New Testament are riddled with doubt, aren't they? I mean, one of the most famous is Zechariah, this priest who becomes the father of John the Baptist. And when the angel of the Lord speaks to him that he's going to have a son, do you remember? He doesn't believe. He laughs, and so what happens to him? He can't talk until the baby is born. But then his son, John the Baptist, who Jesus would call the greatest man who has ever lived, right? These are Jesus' words, not mine, is also given to doubt, isn't he? Because John is proclaiming that the Messiah is going to come, and Jesus comes on the scene, and then very shortly after that, what happens to John? Do you remember? He gets arrested. Now, he has something to do with that. He's really poking the king with a hot poker. If you read some of the things that he's doing, he's not wrong, but he's stirring the pot. But from prison, if you remember the story in the Gospels, John the Baptist sends his followers to Jesus to ask, are you really the one? Because what am I doing in prison here, and how come things haven't changed? And Jesus, if you remember, sends it back and says, here's the proof. The blind see, the lame walk, and so forth and so on. So here's what I want you to see. Like if the one that Jesus calls the greatest man who ever lived, right, is given to that level of doubt, why would we single Thomas out? And why would we not give an open and reflective look in our own hearts? Doubt is a real part of the Christian experience. One of the great preachers that oftentimes is referenced is a guy named Charles Spurgeon. Perhaps you know the name. And Spurgeon, one of his famous quotes is, if a man ever says he never doubts, it is quite time for us to doubt him. Right? In other words, it just doesn't happen. Of course, there are some people who have a gift of faith that is much more prolific than others, and there's different seasons of life, but I want us to see doubt in this holistic kind of universal sense. And here's the way I think it works, is that faith and doubt actually go together. They're actually deeply connected to each other. They are not necessarily the opposite of each other. I don't want to, get to the punchline before I develop the joke, as it were, but the point I want to make to you today is that we are all on a journey between belief and unbelief. The opposite of belief is unbelief. It is not doubt, right? Faith is willing to believe in spite of some level of doubt. Does that make sense? The author of the Hebrews defines it that way, does he not? It says that faith is what? It's the hope in things we can't see or can't touch, right? And so there is this dynamic relationship between the two. That is that you cannot literally say that you have faith if there isn't at some level attached to doubt in some way. Does that make sense? Get where I'm going with this? So now let's try to analyze the situation of Thomas here and attempt to see what I think is the actual bigger point, not doubt, right? We've all been told Thomas doubts, so we go to this looking for doubt. And if you were looking for it, you heard it loud and clear, didn't you? Jesus basically in the NIV yelling at Thomas, stop doubting and believe. I want to tell you, I think it's a bad translation. We'll get there in a second. But also, wildly crazy, they would put an exclamation point after that, which punctuation isn't existing in that way in the original language. It's an interpretive decision that's unfair. We'll make sense of this as we go. How and why would I say that Jesus, well, let's put it this way. I do not think that Jesus is angry at Thomas for doubting. Okay. Why do I not think that? Well, partly because of what I've just said, but two other reasons that are very germane to the story. The first is the character of Jesus, right? Jesus is constantly dealing with people who are lacking in faith, as it were, who are struggling to believe, who are having and wrestling with doubts. Always, always. And he's constantly doing it with gentleness and with grace. Why all of a sudden, at the very end, would he change to vitriol and anger? It just doesn't make sense. We're reading into the text. But maybe even more powerful as evidence in this story here is the context itself. You know who gets off the hook in this story? The other 11. Let's think about them for just a second. What are they doing? John is very descriptive about the other 11, isn't it? They're behind locked doors, right? Hiding out of utter fear. And if you heard the story correctly, when Jesus shows up to them, what does he do to them? He shows them his wounds in his hands and his side. Nothing different than Thomas. You see it? So the context is not that Jesus is angry at Thomas because of this, because he showed up already and did the very thing that Thomas was seeking for the other disciples. So we have to think deeper and read into the context more to really get at what's happening here. And what I think is happening here is Jesus is issuing Thomas a warning. And in so doing, John is using it as a warning for all of us. If you notice that at the very last verse of John chapter 20, it sounded like a conclusion, didn't it? Because most scholars rightly believe, I think, that John's first writing of this gospel, that was it. It ended right there. And then he added on the Peter addendum a little bit later to sort of wrap the Peter story up, because you realize Peter was left out hanging after all of his denials. We'll talk about that next week. I don't want to go there now. But if it's true that the original ending was right here, then Thomas becomes the climax of the whole thing, right? Because John all along has been saying, I'm telling you this so that you will believe. And now look at Thomas. He's the one I'm holding up. Now here's where we have to remember that earlier in the story, when we've been introduced to Thomas only once, he was actually the champion of faith. Do you remember? I tried to point it out then very carefully, knowing we would come up to this later. But all the other disciples, when Jesus says, I've got to go towards Jerusalem, I've got to go to Bethany, I've got to be with Lazarus who has passed, and I've got to deal with all of his stuff, all the disciples are like, don't do it. And Thomas says, let's go with him and die. I mean, that's utter surrender, if we want to use that word, right? That is the epitome of faith. But now we have a Thomas who's like, I'm not so sure. And this is the Christian life. Does it make sense? And we have to be honest with this if we're going to process it correctly. I think it's verse 27 or wherever it is, where it says, stop doubting and believe. I wouldn't have put the original language up here for you, but I thought, it might bore you to death. If you notice, the New Testament was written in Greek. That was the language of the day. And the phrase is, me gnu apistos ala pistos. It's actually an incredibly beautiful literary moment. Apistos ala pistos, right? Some of you might know this. Whenever you add the prefix a, the letter a is a prefix in front of something, it negates, right? And pistos is the word for faith or for belief. And Allah is the Greek word for but. Don't be unbelieving, but be believing. That's what that verse means. It doesn't mean stop doubting and believe. It could mean, hey, stop doubting and believe. But it's not the judgmental tone we often read into it. In fact, the verb genu, actually a better translation of it, because genomai is the verb, and it's actually a word of like giving birth to something, like begetting something or giving birth to it. So it's actually become is actually the better translation than be. Do not become unbelieving, but become believing. Do you see that? There's this idea of growing into something that is happening here. And this is what Jesus is warning us about, is that we are always moving in one direction or the other in this spiritual journey of ours. Because we're never standing stationary somewhere. We're either a trajectory towards more and more belief, or on a trajectory towards less and less belief. And sometimes the slope is steep, and sometimes the slope is pretty flat, but we're always moving, shifting in the same way that Thomas was. Now listen, for those of you who have believed the gospel, I'm not suggesting that you can unbelieve the gospel. That's what I'm talking about. But in the practicalities and the realities of life, we're on this slope all of the time. And for whatever reason right now, I think there are pretty obvious reasons, Thomas is trending towards unbelief. He's becoming unbelieving. And Jesus says, take stock and change. And Thomas, it's not just for him, but for all of the disciples who were in the locked room, and then also for all of us who would later believe, to which John, or Jesus himself actually, gives some credence, right? Have you ever thought about this before? Well, at least the disciples got to see Jesus. At least they got to see his wounds. We've not been afforded that reality. And Jesus, knowing full well in the future that would be true, makes his last statement here in the Gospel of John, blessed are those who believe even without sight. That faith is a part of this thing, even as challenging as it sometimes can be. What's going on in Thomas? What's leading him down this path? What's moving him away from faith, as it were? Well, I think it's pretty obvious, isn't it? It's the crucifixion. Thomas had a very set idea of who Jesus was, or at least, better said, who he thought he was, and what he thought he needed to do. And it's the same expectation that most of the Jewish people in and around the world of Jesus had, that a Messiah who was to come was going to free them from the oppression of the Romans, reestablish a kingship over Israel or Judah in that time, and then God would come dwell with his people again. That would solve all of the problems. Of course, Jesus was far more in tune to the problems of our hearts as opposed to the external oppressions in our world. And that if the problem of sin wasn't dealt with in the hearts of people, oppression couldn't be stopped in the world. He had a much bigger idea, and basically he exploded the box that Thomas had put him in, right? And quite frankly, listen, he exploded the box that all of the other 11 disciples had put him in, including Judas, which probably led to Judas' betrayal of him. And you can understand the trauma of this, especially if to someone who had, in essence, given himself and his life to the messianic cause of Jesus. Again, all of these reasons why we could never read into this Jesus getting angry with him about not being able to process all of this. He knew all along they would struggle to process it. And so too it's true for us, isn't it? That typically the causes of doubt, as it were, or the things that move us towards unbelief, in a better reflection of the text, happen in the same ways. When Jesus breaks the box that we've put him in, when he reveals himself to be a little bit more than we expected or wanted him to be. Now, it might not look like Thomas, but for us it looks like this in a number of ways, doesn't it? That is, that when God doesn't come through for us in the way we expect him to come through for us, right? That oftentimes moves us in a path towards unbelieving, doesn't it? Or how about this? When the mysterious nature of God is revealed, or at least the framework in which we've processed the world is broken open a little bit. Oftentimes this happens through science or other things, right? And we can't process that because it doesn't fit in the box that we've made. Do you know, for the longest time, the church and science believed that the world revolved around the earth. They believed it so strongly that you would be killed if you suggested any other. Right? And it was deeply ingrained in the theology because the earth was the place where humanity was created and God came and was redeeming it, so that you could make a case for it in that world. But Copernicus and other people are starting to explore and understand that actually it doesn't work that way, does it? The solar system revolves around the sun. It's a heliocentric world. And that exploded the box, the theological box that people had made for God. Listen, I'm not suggesting to you that certain things are up for grabs or anything like that. I just want to say that we oftentimes add extra to our perception of God, and we don't always realize how much extra we're bringing. And sometimes that's the stuff that gets knocked out. And if our faith is built on the foundation of the extra, we're in trouble of collapsing. You see it? For Thomas, Jesus wasn't the problem. Is that his faith was based on who he thought Jesus needed to be for him, as opposed to who Jesus actually was and what he was doing. And when he saw Jesus for who he was, changed everything, didn't it? Suddenly he's back on a trajectory towards believing. And we need that kind of recentering. Last thing, oftentimes our move towards doubt, if you say it that way, or towards unbelieving is the result of other Christians, or shall we say God's people, living hypocritical lives or harming us in some way. And unfortunately, this has happened to way too many of us. And as I always try to do when we have these moments, I need to pause, and I need to ask for your forgiveness on the basis of what has been done to you. Not because I'm saying I did it to you, but because as a leader in the church, you deserve to be apologized to for the things that have happened to you by people in the name of Jesus. It's not right, it's not fair, and it's not of God. However, our faith is not built on the performance of other Christians. It's built on who Jesus is. I once heard a pastor, I think from Australia, give an illustration that blew my mind, and it's just perfect. I am not deeply into classical music, but classical music is probably the only way this really fits extraordinarily well. And that is that you could set up a number of different violin players up here. Or let's do it this way, because we have a really good classically trained guitar player here. Do you know, I have owned a guitar for a while. There's a reason why I'm not up here playing it in front of you, right? You wouldn't like that. I wouldn't like that. It wouldn't go good. But let's say we took a piece of classical music, and I've heard Adam play classical music before. He does an incredible job at it. And let's say that we took his guitar, which is way better than my old crummy guitar at home. It was a really good, capable instrument. And I went first and played the classical piece. And it would be, I don't know, you grade me on an A to an F and you're feeling charitable, let's give me a D minus, right? We'll pass you because we kind of like you, right? Or if you're holding grudges against me, just give me an F. That's what I deserve. And then Adam gets up and plays it, and you would say, wow, that's incredible. But guess what? No offense to Adam, but there are even better guitar players in the world who have played their whole life. You see the point? And here's the thing. If we judge the piece of music on the instrument, on the person who's playing the instrument, then we've done an injustice to the music. And for many of us, we are judging Christian faith on people who are playing the music instead of the music that's actually been written. And we're doing a great injustice to ourselves because of that. It does not absolve the pain that you have encountered or felt. It does not make it right or okay. It does not mean they were wrong, or in some cases their wrongs need to be dealt with. But it does not change the veracity or the validity of the gospel and who Jesus is. And what you give yourself to will either move you towards belief or unbelief. What is it in the case of the disciples and Thomas that we need to observe here? Because at this moment, we need to include the story of Mary that we started this whole post-Easter journey through. Mary is distinguished from all of the 12 disciples, isn't she? Do you remember? Because they go, two of them at least go and see an empty tomb and then run back, lock the doors, and hide. It says they kind of believed, but they didn't understand what's going on. But Mary stayed. Do you remember? And she wept, and she was searching for Jesus, and guess what happened? Jesus showed up. We see the difference between retreating and hiding and searching for Jesus and what the end result leads to on the scale of belief versus unbelief. Let's distinguish between the 11 disciples and Thomas. Why does Thomas get singled out in a particular way? Am I losing? Oh, I'm good. Why does Thomas get singled out in this particular way in this moment? Because the first time Jesus showed up, he wasn't there, right? He wasn't hanging out with the disciples in that moment. Now, we're not privy to why, whether there was a family emergency or whether, he just wasn't up for it in that moment or whether he was struggling and off doing his own thing. But he wasn't there, and by not being there, he missed an encounter with Jesus. And so as we process all of these things, we understand, I think, that Jesus is calling us to intentionally put ourselves in places that increase and build our belief, as opposed to putting ourselves in places that move us towards unbelief. Does it make sense? And so it is for us, friends. I mean, if the trajectory of your life is seeking Jesus, or if it is just retreating from it all, that's going to have a profound impact on whether you are moving towards belief or towards unbelief. Doubt will not have a profound impact on whether you're moving towards belief or unbelief. Because if you're seeking Jesus in the midst of doubt, I'm convinced that he will continue to reveal himself to you in a gentle and gracious way so that you are seeing him for who he is, perhaps over time or as long as it takes. But if you were retreating and pulling back, then you're going to be absent from that. Does it make sense? Doubt's not the problem here. I don't think Jesus has any concern with the fact that Thomas had doubt. He's reminding him, where were you in these last two places? Matters, doesn't it? In the same way, it matters who we surround ourselves with. The voices that we're letting speak to us, who our formative community is profoundly important. It's why it matters that we gather together weekly. Why? Because we're people who doubt. We're prone to it. We need to be in a community that recenters us and reminds us that we do believe even though we have unbelief, and it moves us towards belief. It reminds us of the truth of the glory of God and the gospel and what Jesus has done and all of these profound things. But if we retreat from it, if we isolate ourselves and we're left only to our own thoughts, then we have a trajectory away from belief. Does it make sense? We don't know what Thomas was doing, but we know he wasn't surrounded by the disciples. Who was he listening to? And friends, if he was, you say, he's just listening to himself. Well, I got news for you, because I've done that sometimes. It's not a great place to spend a whole lot of time, It's not that you can't have positive self-talk and all that stuff is important, but if we leave ourselves to our own flesh and our own opinions, then we have no one else speaking into it. It doesn't mean you have to embrace everything everyone else says, but it's our collective faith that carries us through the day. One of my jobs as your pastor is at times to have belief for you when you don't have belief. However, all of our jobs together as brothers and sisters in Christ is to sometimes have belief for each other when we don't have belief in that moment. We're struggling, right? It's hard. Listen, I've given my whole adult life to reading the Bible, studying it, serving God, all of these things. But when it feels like God doesn't come through for me in my perceived idea of how it ought to work, I'm just telling you, as a 45-year-old pastor, that's really hard. Do you know what helps me in those moments? You. and seeking Jesus and being intentional in putting myself in the places. If I leave myself to my own thoughts, that can drive me in a bad direction. If I go listen to a bunch of people who are trying to dismiss faith and all those things, that matters. Who we surround ourselves with is who we become. I mean, that's sociologically true. That's why it matters, right? I mean, you could preach this in an old-fashioned, legalistic, religious way and say, that's why you never miss a Sunday, right? Because Thomas missed a Sunday and it changed everything. We don't believe that, right? Life happens. Other things are going on. You're on mission engaging your neighbors. That's not the point. But if you are isolating yourself from Christian community, you are in danger. You're in danger. Because you were never meant to live in an isolated fashion. You are setting yourself up for unbelief. Statistics show that the first thing that happens before people move away from faith is they pull away from the church. Listen, you don't have to tell me reasons why you might be interested in pulling away the church. I could give you a longer list than you have, right? I get it. You're sitting next to, look next to them and smile at them and, under your breath say, you're a flawed human being. And sometimes you disappoint me, right? Don't do that for real. But you can, we live amongst broken people. We're going to get it wrong sometimes. We're going to play the wrong chord, hit the wrong note, squeak our reeded instrument, whatever it is. It's not going to always work out together. But that's not the point. The point is that the resurrection is true. It has profoundly changed everything, and we are constantly reminding each other of it, because sometimes you have faith that I don't have, and sometimes I have faith that you don't have, and that's why we need each other. It's not always what you get, but it is often what you give. Community matters profoundly. Listen, in our world, especially amongst the evangelical church, as it were, there's a word that gets used a lot, deconstruction. Perhaps you've heard it. It's just a postmodern philosophical word. The postmodern philosophers of the 1960s coined the word deconstruction, which basically means anything that's built up, we're going to blow up, right? And we'll see what stands. And we can understand its sense in a certain way, because in the modern world it was we could achieve perfection. And we finally come to the realization, no, we can't, right? So you have two choices, right? Let's blow it all up and see what stands. Well, you know what's going to happen. It's going to all blow up. Or you can thoughtfully engage your faith in a community where you're allowed to have honest questions, where they are not only invited, but they are welcomed completely. Because here's what I believe. The most profound growth in people's life happens when they ask hard questions. For way too long, the church has said, don't ask questions. Why? It's a foundationalist belief. Because we're afraid if you ask questions, you'll uncover a false truth. I don't think Jesus talks that way, does he? He's like, ask all the questions you want, and you'll continue to find that ultimate truth is actually found here. Hope is a place not only where you should be okay asking questions, but where I want you to ask questions, but I want you to ask them here. Not off in some chat room with a bunch of people who don't know the gospel or who aren't processing it in the same way. Listen, faith is an ever-growing thing, right? And sometimes the box or the baggage that we carry from our childhood or from experiences that we have, sometimes you need someone to helpfully scrape some of that stuff off, right? That is, that deconstruction is actually part of growing faith, so long as you're doing it in a healthy way. Because we never get it right. We're always bringing other things in that aren't part of it. And we need to lose that stuff while still holding to the foundational truth. I heard an author write it this way, too, and it makes an awful lot of sense to me. So much, if you grew up in the church, so much of your understanding of God and the gospel comes from that young age. Well, here's the truth, and parents of younger kids, you know this, that the way you speak about faith and the gospel to kids is very different than the way you speak about faith and the gospel to adults. who have lived a longer life, who have seen all kinds of other things, who have much bigger questions about the reality of things. It is that the faith you embraced when you were 6 is not going to sustain you when you're 26. And if you're trying to do that, it's going to fall away. It'd be like this, what the author said. It'd be like going home to your parents' house, climbing into the attic, finding the old box your parents have likely kept of your baby clothes, and trying to see if you can fit in them still. Right? It's nonsense. It doesn't work. That doesn't mean that Jesus isn't who he said he is, the resurrection isn't true. It just means things aren't as simple and perfectly packaged as they seemed when we were 6, 7, 8, and 9, when we could believe anything, right? And so faith is always meant to be grasped with and wrestled with in community for our sake and for our growth. This is who we are. A couple of things happen in this Thomas story that seem important to me. The first is community, right? In terms of what trajectory are you on? Trajectory towards belief or towards unbelief? Community is of utter importance. Jesus shows that, and Thomas shows that. I've kind of beaten that drum, so I'll leave it go. The second is worship. Right? And what I mean by worship is not necessarily the 3 songs we sang to start the service, although they're good and they're important, that's why we do it. I'm talking more holistically, like the orientation of your life. And specifically, who you see Jesus to be. Do you see him for who he is? Your vision of Jesus determines so much about how you order and live your life. Is your vision of Jesus based on what some Christians have done at some point in your life? Is it based on how God didn't come through you? Or do you see Jesus for who he actually is? When Thomas sees him, what does he say? My Lord and my God. In all of the New Testament, you will not have a more profound, more bold, more beautiful declaration of who Jesus actually is. And who does it come from? Doubting Thomas. Right? Of course it does. Because in his wrestle, he saw Jesus, and it changed things. Don't live by a characterization of Jesus. See him for who he really is. And then lastly, vocation. I told you this would come up every single time. Is it not fascinating to you that Jesus basically breaks in to the hiding disciples, right? He doesn't even break in, other places we find. He just kind of shows up. You're like, poof, there he is, It's like we thought we could keep people out, and there he is. And they're crazy doubting people. They're terrified. They're hiding. They don't want to be associated with Jesus because it might cost them their life. And what does Jesus immediately do after showing himself to them? It says he breathed on them, and he says, in the same way the Father sent me, I'm sending you. What? These people? I mean, Mary we could make sense of, right? She was willing to put her life on the line. She was looking for him. But these guys? Yeah. And so too of us, right? Oh man, if you only saw the last week of my life, you would know that Jesus would never call me to do that. Well, did you see the last week of these guys' lives? Every single person who has an interaction with the resurrected Jesus, as is true of you if you have believed, is called. Is called to bear witness. I have seen the Lord. Even Thomas. Especially Thomas. Why? Because the world is just like Thomas. Filled with all kinds of questions. And I've got news for you. You, nor I, nor Thomas, nor Peter will ever be able to answer them all, and certainly not perfectly. But we can continually point people to the utter truth of the resurrection and together wrestle through all the implications that means for our life. Therefore, that the gospel is true, and this is who God is, and this is what he's doing. And then you wrestle together through all of the questions as a witness. I think actually the last statement that Jesus makes, blessed are those who believe without seeing, is not only a statement for people in the future who will believe like you and me, but it's actually a statement of faith to Thomas that says, listen, as challenging as this was for you, and I get it, it was, you're going to see me do way more through you than you could ever imagine. Who are the people who are going to believe without seeing? The ones that Thomas speaks to. And because of his developing faith, he's going to be able to develop faith in others. Those who are on a trajectory towards belief are engaging with others and calling them to the same way. Listen, friends, I know a lot of your stories. And for many of you, especially in this season, there's heavy, heavy stuff. And I would never make light of it. I simply say to you in the midst of it, please be intentional about putting yourself in the right spaces as you process this. And let us ask really good questions together. And hopefully you will find no one in Hope who's going to say, well, it's just like this, but who's going to process it with you and love you and develop you and keep pointing you towards the truth of the resurrection and what that must mean in some ways. For some of you, you're carrying all kinds of baggage from years past. Man, I would love the opportunity to help you just sand some of that off. Clean some of the barnacles off that old ship and see if she still doesn't float. Because I think it does. We can't determine who Jesus is on the basis of what other people have done in his name. Doubt is not the enemy. Doubt is an opportunity. An opportunity for belief or for unbelief. How would you process it? You pray with me? Jesus, you are right to remind us that we are always moving in a direction. Whether we are believers in Jesus or we, at this point in our lives, have rejected the gospel, we're still moving in a direction, closer towards belief or farther away from it. And if we have believed towards more and more belief, we're distancing ourselves from it, controlling our own lives, running our own show. Would you, in the power of your Spirit, speak directly to each of us? Give us a moment of personal assessment. And then, Spirit, would you gently nudge us towards a little more intentionality in our lives? Listening to the truth, surrounding ourselves with the right people, seeing Jesus for who he actually is, not some characterization of him, even that we have created, processing our pain and our struggles in open and honest ways instead of just talking to ourselves. And Jesus, for those who are seeking you, would you make yourself imminently available and present? For those who need it in this moment, would you say, throw your hand in my side? Here I am. It's true. We love you. We praise you. Amen.